6 lead guitar songwriting tips right now on Spike Signal. Let's go. Tip number 1 is to use contrary motion in harmony. Now, so often in lots of kinds of metal, whether it be from Metallica or melodic death metal like In Flames, there are lots of harmonized passages in the lead lines to add a lot of extra texture and honestly just sheer frickin' beauty to any lead part. These parts are typically harmonized in thirds, so for example in A minor we'd be harmonizing the A note, the 1, with the C note, the flat 3, but that's not to say you always have to harmonize things in this manner. There are definitely instances where you should be harmonizing notes outside of just thirds, for example fourths and even maybe fifths depending on the situation. Ultimately what drives this is the underlying chord, implied chord beneath the lead based off of the rhythm guitar as well as the bass. This is one of those things where you can use theory to sort of ascertain what the harmony should be by looking at what chord is implied and seeing whether a third or a fourth harmony would most fit inside that chord's triad. But honestly, guessing and checking in your notation software or recording in your DAW works fine too, so it's not like you have to stress over this or anything like that. It can just sometimes be good to check other harmonies if they're not working. And on that front we get to contrary motion, which is the idea of having lines going in contrary directions from each other, as the name implies. So for example, we might have a harmonized guitar passage where 2 guitars are playing a 1 and its octave, and instead of following along the line in a parallel fashion like you'd see in parallel harmony, the guitar lines slowly make their way closer together, so what initially was a harmony of an 8th or an octave turns into be a harmony of a 6th, then a 5th, then a 3rd, than a 1. Basically, one guitarist is sequencing up and the other is sequencing down. Now, it is something you want to make sure to implement tastefully because it can be more challenging than just following parallel lines and thirds, but it can be a really cool thing if done properly. And for some songs, it's done in very subtle ways too, or maybe a single note or two is moving in a contrary fashion and then kind of aligning back to parallel movement later on. So super cool and fun thing to experiment with. Should definitely give it a try. The next tip involves guitar lines weaving in and out of a lead roll or rhythm roll within the instance of even a single measure. I was transcribing a song that had a harmonized guitar part, and one of the lead guitars, the main lead guitar let's call it, was playing kind of prototypical lead stuff the entire time, but the lower harmony, the sort of supporting harmony, was at the very end of the passage for like 2 beats or so, actually not following along with the harmony underneath, but instead playing almost rhythmic chords with that before the passage repeated and the lower harmonized guitar initiated a harmony roll again instead of playing chords. There can be all kinds of reasons for this to be necessary or not necessary, like for example, sometimes harmony lines just don't sound quite as good when certain chords are implied versus others, so it's easier for the rhythm guitar to just kind of play along with those implied chords in the bass. Or it can be something that's done for aesthetic reasons, simply to give a little bit of beef where before there was some nice kind of sing-songy harmonized stuff to kind of anchor it down with a little bit more mid-range. With good mixing, it can sound very seamless as well, so it's definitely worth something trying if you feel like a harmony part isn't quite hitting in lead lines. Maybe make one of those guitar lines do some rhythmic stuff, if only for half a measure or so, just to see if it helps. The next tip is a very simple one, but it's just to have a guitar line, or really any instrument, doing something repetitious, probably revolving around the 1 of a minor scale to add some intensity. This is actually, I think, one of the easiest yet most bang for your buck ways to give a little bit more punch to your song, by having one guitar line hang out on the minor note, the 1 of a minor scale, while the rhythm guitar and the vocals are doing whatever else they were doing. It's just that little bit of extra intensity to drive that passage forward. We also hear this a lot with music that has pads in it. Sometimes a keyboardist will just hang out on a chord based off of the root of the minor, the 1 of the minor, in order to add that extra intensity while the rhythm guitars and the vocals are doing whatever they are doing. The lead guitar can do this too though, a lot, especially if it's played in octave chords. So a very simple thing, but a useful thing nonetheless. Moving along, the next tip that we have is using muted notes in a solo. Now when I say muted notes, I don't necessarily mean palm muted, but I mean literally muting the strings with your fingers and plucking them. Again, something very simple in concept, but something that takes just the right kind of placement and actual practice. I was transcribing a song solo that had a single instance of a muted note, best I could tell listening from the track, and it was in a section where the guitar was just kind of intentionally trying to sound chaotic, almost like the guitarist didn't know what he was doing, but Of course he knew what he was doing. He was just sounding that way in order to give some kind of chaotic intensity. But a mute note is a great way to get at that, just like sliding down a string is, or just like playing a random arpeggio really fast is within a scale. And if you do it right, it can really break up the monotony of a solo. So definitely something to explore using. Now for the next tip, I'd say this might be one of the coolest ones, yet ironically hardest to hear out of all of them, and that is how to have a lead guitar line going while at the same time as a singer is singing, and having them both be independent of each other. Now a lot of this comes down to how it's mixed and making sure that the lead guitar is set back far in the mix enough so the singer doesn't have their line stepped on. But going back to the idea of chord tone soloing that I did a video on a while ago, if you can match very closely to the chords that are implied in the bass and rhythm line, but also by what the vocalist is singing, you can actually play independent lines of what the vocalist is singing on your lead guitar without things getting all kind of mixed up and confused and it just sounding like too much. The range of notes you'll have to play in your lead guitar line might be very limited because you have to match very closely to what the singer is doing. Again, not pitch for pitch, but just in terms of the movements you're making. But if done right and mixed properly in the back, it can be a wonderful almost Easter egg for someone to find after they've listened to the song a lot, and when listening closely, perhaps on the proper pair of headphones or speakers, be able to pick out a line that they never noticed. That's what happened to me when I was transcribing the song. It was pretty sick, so I'd say give it a shot. And the final tip for today is alternating tuplets in solo. So tuplets are things like triplets. We've all used triplets before in various ways, but there are tuplets beyond triplets. There are septuplets and sextuplets and all kinds of things like that. And while you don't need to write a solo in any kind of manner just to use them, oftentimes if you're just playing to a track or a beat and soloing, you very well, in fact, I'd say it'd be quite likely that you'd end up employing tuplets that are different than triplets without even trying. When you go back and if you were to try to transcribe what you played there, you might find your soloing speeding up and slowing down in certain intervals depending on where you're at. If you were to go back and try to transcribe what you were playing, just kind of, going around with the beat, you might find yourself speeding up and slowing down in a way that only could conform to notes you could put down as tuplets. So for example, if you're playing something that's faster than 16th notes but slower than 16th note triplets, there might be a tuplet in there you could use, and you'd have to kind of test to see what sounds optimal to your track to notate out what you were doing. And of course, for actual songwriting, the other way it goes is to think that, I don't have to be restricted to just playing these 8th notes, these 16th notes, these 8th note or 16th note triplets. The ranges of speed you have is really unlimited. And I gotta say, listening to certain songs, it becomes quite evident that guys aren't necessarily staying to just one form like that. Often, I would assume they're just playing what sounds good in their heads at whatever speed it is. And some of those passages end up falling into what would be classified as like 8th note septuplets or something to that effect. So you got options there, and if you're ever trying to play or transcribe something that's a little bit in between of the typical speeds that you might see in a notation software, remember you can use some different tuplets. All right, I hope you guys got something out of that. I hope it significantly helps your songwriting. If you could like this video, subscribe, and leave a comment with your favorite lead tips, I would really appreciate it. I'm Steven Spikes, and I'll see you next time on Spike Signal. Thank you.